27 seconds, that's all it took for Jasmine Crockett to corner Governor Greg Abbott under the blinding lights of a live Capitol hearing. With flood survivors staring him down, 112 dead still fresh in the headlines, she accused him of obeying a criminal in the White House. Cameras caught the exact moment his confidence shattered. What truth could hit so hard that it left a governor begging for the hearing to end? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The red on-air light burst to life like a warning flare, washing the Texas state Capitol hearing room in an eerie crimson glow, as if signaling the start of a battle. Camera lenses swung sharply toward the long, polished mahogany table at the center, glass eyes ready to beam every flicker, every tremor, every betrayal of emotion to millions of homes across America. Outside, through the thick paneled doors, a chant pounded in rhythm with the beating hearts inside. Our votes matter. Our votes matter. The sound was not background noise. It was a war drum, rattling the air, leaking into every corner of the chamber. The double doors creaked open and Jasmine Crockett stepped in, her stride steady, the black of her suit absorbing the light like armor. Every head turned. There was no mistaking her intent. She wasn't here to speak politely. She was here to strike. Greg Abbott sat rigid at the witness table, back straight, jaw set, hands folded in the kind of pose politicians rehearse in mirrors to look unshaken. But his eyes betrayed the first crack, flicking quickly to the portrait hanging high behind him. Donald Trump, frozen in a smug half-smile. The network cameras had framed it perfectly, Abbott's profile in the foreground, Trump's painted gaze looming over his shoulder, like a puppeteer watching his marionette perform. The room seemed to inhale at once as Jasmine approached the microphone. No preamble, no softened edges, her first word sliced clean through the hush. "Governor Abbott," she began, her voice even but edged with steel, "you are not leading this state. You are taking orders from a criminal in the White House." The sound hit like a detonation. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat skip. Abbott's shoulders stiffened, his fingers twitched against the tabletop, and for the briefest moment his skin seemed to lose its color. Every camera zoomed tighter. In that silence, the weight of the accusation lingered, hanging between them like a live wire. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen clattered to the floor, the nose jarring against the quiet. Abbott opened his mouth to speak, but Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, her eyes locking on him with the precision of a sniper's scope. "So tell me, Governor," she said, her tone dropping half an octave, "what could possibly make you trade the will of the people for the will of one man?" The question landed like a trap-snapping shot. And as the nation watched, the governor's face turned just a shade paler. The answer, whatever it was, suddenly feeling far too dangerous to say aloud. The chamber doors groaned open again, and this time the air shifted, heavy, almost suffocating. Through the aisle walked an elderly couple, their steps slow but unyielding, the man's weathered hand gripping a folded American flag, the woman clutching a tin box, dented and stained with mud. They stopped behind Jasmine, eyes locked on Abbott, as if willing him to see what the cameras would soon make sure the entire country saw. A staffer followed, carrying a cardboard frame wrapped in clear plastic. Inside, a child's school photograph, water-damaged and buckled at the edges. The mother stepped forward, her voice cracking but sharp enough to cut through the static in the air. Her son's name, his age, the way the water came without warning. 112 dead, entire neighborhoods swallowed, and while bodies were still being pulled from debris, Greg Abbott was in meetings drafting maps that carved voting power out of Black and Latino communities. No emergency bill, no flood relief package, just lines on a map drawn to erase woes. From outside, the sound surged again. Shame, shame. Louder now, pounding against the walls like the floodwaters that had torn through the hill country. "Governor, these people buried their dead while you redrew political boundaries." Abbott's eyes darted to the cameras, then to the portrait behind him, and for the first time, he seemed to shrink in his chair. The couple's hands trembled, but they did not look away. The mother with the photograph held it up high enough for every lens to catch. In that frozen tableau, grief, rage, power, and shame colliding. The silence was more brutal than any shouted accusation. Jasmine let it hang, then leaned into the mic, her words landing like a gavel strike. "Tell them, Governor. Tell the people of Texas why their lives were worth less than your maps." And in that instant, it wasn't the floodwater that drowned the room. It was the weight of his silence. Jasmine didn't break eye contact as she reached under her stack of notes and pulled out a weathered, tabbed copy of the Texas Constitution. The overhead lights caught the gold embossed seal, making it gleam in the camera's frame. She held it up with one hand, fingers steady, and flipped deliberately to a bookmarked page. Article 3, Section 10, she read, her voice low but sharpened to a point. Permits members to break quorum when necessary to protect the rights of their constituents. The chamber seemed to contract around her words. Abbott leaned slightly forward, pen tapping once against the tabletop, his lips curling into a thin, dismissive smile. Cowardice, he shot back, his tone carrying that politician's blend of practiced disdain and calculated provocation. You were elected to show up, not to run. The smirk that spread across Jasmine's face wasn't amusement. It was the smile of a hunter who's just heard her prey step into the snare. She tilted her head, eyes locked on him like crosshairs. Then why, Governor, she said slowly, letting each word strike the air like a hammer, did you run from helping these people? The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it was suffocating. You could hear the faint hum of the cameras, the shuffle of a reporter adjusting his tripod, the quickened breath of the mother still clutching her son's photograph in the gallery. Abbott's pen froze mid-tap, his grip tightening until his knuckles whitened. From the back of the room came a cough, quickly stifled, but it sounded like a gunshot in the tension. Abbott glanced toward the exit, then back to Jasmine, and for a heartbeat it looked as if the weight of her question had landed squarely on his chest. She didn't let him breathe. She leaned an inch closer to the mic, her voice dropping just enough for the boom mix to catch every syllable. If a governor won't defend his own people, she paused, the words hanging heavy. Her gaze cut sharper, her tone colder. Then who, or what, is he really protecting? The question didn't just hang there. It coiled, ready to strike, and the whole room leaned in, waiting to see if Greg Abbott would survive the answer. Jasmine let the silence from her last question linger just long enough for the air to feel heavy, then slid a thick, unmarked folder across the table toward the clerk. The cameras caught the way Abbott's eyes followed it, not curious, but wary, like a man recognizing the shape of a weapon before it's drawn. She waited until every lens was trained on her, then pulled out the first page, holding it between her fingers so the press gallery could see the official state letterhead. This, she said, her voice steady, is an email from the governor's office to the legal team of one Donald J. Trump. A low murmur rippled through the room. Dated 3 days after the Hill Country flood, when over 100 Texans were still missing. She began to read. The language was cold, clinical, outlining priority districts for boundary adjustment and strategic removal of high-density minority precincts. Then her voice sharpened. And hear this line. Target TX14, TX29, and TX32, high Black and Latino turnout. Secure replacement maps before midterms. The words hung in the air like a confession no one wanted to hear. From the press gallery came an audible gasp, the kind that cameras love because it tells the audience at home they're witnessing something seismic. One reporter's pen snapped in his grip. Abbott shifted in his seat, his pen now motionless, his eyes darting toward his aide seated just behind him. One leaned forward, whispering something quickly, but Abbott's only response was a slow, deliberate blink. Jasmine didn't look at them. She looked straight at the governor, her next words like a blade turned in a fresh wound. Governor, these aren't maps, they're weapons. And the targets are your own citizens. Outside, the crowd nose swelled again. Shame, shame. The chant sensing with the thud of security boots repositioning at the chamber doors. Jasmine set the page down, picked up another, and another. Each one a receipt, each one a nail in the coffin. She didn't raise her voice, but with each document her tone grew colder, more deliberate, as though stripping away any excuse before it could form. Abbott's jaw worked once, as if he might speak, but nothing came. The portrait of Trump behind him seemed to loom larger in the camera frame, his painted smirk almost mocking the silence. Jasmine paused, letting the scene burn into the minds of everyone watching at home. Then she leaned forward, voice dropping just enough to pull the room in. So tell us, Governor, when you read through those lines, were you defending Texas or defending him? The question hit like a live charge, and for a heartbeat, the entire chamber felt like it was waiting for an explosion that hadn't yet come. A chair scraped loudly across the floor as a Republican committee member leaned into his mic, his voice rising with the sharpness of someone desperate to derail the moment. "Point of order, Madam Chair." But Jasmine didn't even glance his way. Her eyes stayed locked on the pages in front of her as she read, line after damning line, each one more poisonous to Abbott's defense than the last. The interruptions became background noise, like a mosquito whining in the dark. She knew if she stopped, the rhythm would break, the tension would ease, and that was the one thing she couldn't allow. Behind Abbott, two aides leaned in close, their faces pale, whispering with the urgency of firefighters trapped in a blaze. One handed him a folded note, the other pointed toward the exit, as if escape was an option. Abbott's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching at the hinge, his pen now gripped like a weapon rather than a tool for signing bills. Every camera in the room was zeroed in on the small betrayals of his composure. The way his eyes darted, the way his hand clenched just a fraction too long after turning a page. Jasmine didn't look at him this time. She looked directly into the main network camera, her voice cutting through the chamber like the crack of a rifle. "Texas is not Mar-a-Lago's playground." The words detonated beyond the walls before they even stopped echoing. In living rooms, offices, and diners across America, screens lit up with comment streams exploding in real time. Hashtag Puppet Governor surged past 20,000 mentions in minutes. Hashtag Stand with Jasmine trended second, climbing fast. One viewer posted, "This is history. Don't blink." Another, "She just broke him on live TV." The Republican member tried again to interrupt, but his voice sounded smaller now, almost drowned by the chorus of phones buzzing in the pockets of staffers and journalists as the outside world crashed into the room. Abbott shifted his weight, exhaled through his nose, and for a split second his shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in the realization that the fight was slipping away from him in real time, streamed in high definition to millions. Jasmine turned another page slowly, deliberately, letting the sound of paper against paper slice through the air. Her gaze returned to Abbott, unblinking, as if daring him to reclaim the silence she had stolen from him. "So, Governor," she said finally, each syllable deliberate, "if Texas doesn't belong to him, then why does every map in your office carry his fingerprints?" The chamber froze, and somewhere outside, the chant of shame rose again, louder, as if the crowd already knew there would be no good answer. The next blow didn't come from Jasmine's folder. It came from the desk in front of Greg Abbott. A faint, insistent vibration cut through the tension, a sound everyone in the room recognized instantly. On the lacquered wood, his phone danced in place, the screen lighting up in sharp, unforgiving white. The name was impossible to miss. Donald J. Trump. Even the camera operators, trained to avoid close-ups without permission, couldn't resist zooming in. The image was beamed to every live stream, every cable feed, an unspoken headline in motion. Trump is calling. Abbott's eyes flicked to the device, then to his aides, who froze like statues. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to stop breathing. The press gallery leaned forward as if drawn by gravity, lenses tilting to catch the frame. Jasmine didn't move, didn't speak. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, letting the moment build its own electricity. The phone kept buzzing, louder somehow, the vibration rattling against the table's edge like a ticking detonator. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, Abbott reached forward, and with his thumb, sent the call to voicemail. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of the chamber realizing it had just witnessed something irreversible. Somewhere in the back, a reporter whispered, "Did he joust?" But the question was cut short by the metallic click of camera shutters firing in rapid succession. The clip would be online before Abbott's hand even left the phone, already framed with captions, "Governor ignores Trump live on air." His aides leaned in instantly, speaking in rushed, clipped sentences. One pointed to the phone, the other toward the exit, but Abbott shook his head, eyes fixed on the table as if the grain of the wood held an escape route. The portrait of Trump on the wall seemed to tilt in the shot, a visual trick of the cameraman, perhaps, but to the audience it looked like the painted eyes were staring straight at him, demanding an explanation. Jasmine let the moment stretch, letting the crowd outside swell to a roar that slipped under the chamber doors. She finally leaned toward her mic, her voice measured but carrying the weight of a scalpel about to cut. "Governor," she said, drawing out the title just enough to make it sound like a question in itself. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned toward the main camera, locking eyes with millions watching at home. "What was in that call, and why was it too dangerous for you to answer here?" The words didn't just hang in the air. They ricocheted, daring him to respond, daring him to survive whatever came next. Jasmine rose from her chair and, without a word, signaled to the clerk. To staffers wheeled in towering easels bearing maps nearly as tall as the chamber doors, the paper edges curling under the heat of the spotlights. Bold red lines slashed across the state like fresh wounds, carving through cities, neighborhoods, and communities with surgical precision. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rising like a slow tide. Camera crews scrambled for a clear angle as Jasmine stepped to the first map and traced one of the red cuts with her finger, her nail tapping exactly where the line severed a dense black neighborhood from the district it had belonged to for decades. On the big screen behind her, a live feed from the media desk cut to an inset image. The Economist headline, "The Gerrymandering Arms Race." Beneath it, subtext in stark serif, "Both sides are drawing harder lines. The Republicans face fewer obstacles." The juxtaposition was brutal, a respected global publication confirming, in black and white, the scale of the manipulation now looming over Texas. Jasmine didn't recite statistics. She brought out people. First, a Latino war veteran, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms inked with his unit insignia, stepping to the mic with a voice that cracked on his second sentence. He spoke of how his vote had helped elect the first Hispanic city council member in his district, only to see that district sliced apart like it didn't matter. Next, a black schoolteacher from Dallas, still in her classroom blazer, describing how her community's turnout had doubled in the last election, and how under Abbott's map, her block now belonged to a district 60 miles away. The chamber absorbed their words in taut silence, each testimony another hammer blow. Jasmine let the voices build until the air was taut with anger and disbelief. Then she stepped back into the frame, her tone dropping into something colder, heavier. "Governor Abbott," she said, locking eyes with him over the maps, "these lines aren't just ink on paper. They're a scalpel used to carve out the power of the very people who built this state. They're erasing voices fought for, bled for, and died for." Her words landed without echo, just a sharp, weighted pause that pressed down on everyone in the room. Abbott's gaze flickered toward the maps, then toward the cameras, as if searching for a safe place to land. But there was none. The red lines glared back like evidence at a crime scene, and the portraits of past governors lining the wall seemed to watch in judgment. Jasmine took one step closer to the maps, her hand hovering over a particularly jagged cut. "If these are the battle lines you've chosen, Governor," she said, her voice like a slow turn of the blade, "then tell Texas why the enemy is your own people." The question struck the chamber like a silent explosion, and for a long, brittle moment, no one dared to even breathe. "Cuts," and her voice carried like a prosecutor reading an indictment. "This isn't just Texas, Florida, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio." She let each name drop like a gavel strike, the syllables heavy, deliberate. "All of them running the same operation: carve out the black vote here, dismantle the Latino vote there, neutralize the districts that dared to hold them accountable." The room seemed to shrink as she moved closer to the table, her words pulling the walls in. She raised a single sheet of paper, a bullet point memo labeled MAGA Playbook, Redistricting Strategy, its header unmistakable even from the press seats. "Governor Abbott," she continued, "you're not just part of this. You are the tip of the spear." The phrase hung sharp and dangerous. She flipped the page, reading off dates and directives, Florida pushing its maps through while lawsuits pile up, Missouri targeting the seat of a black reverend, Indiana carving out the district of Andre Carson, Ohio splitting Amelia Sykes's base into 3 separate voting zones. "These are not coincidences, they are orders, orders you are helping execute." Abbott's eyes darted from the paper to the maps to the cameras, each movement quick and unmoored. His pen tapped once, twice, then stopped. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them. The close-up shots caught the tension in his jaw, the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. His body language screamed what his voice refused to admit. Jasmine's tone didn't waver, but her pace slowed just enough to make the next sentence land with weight. "This is not governance, this is siege warfare against the very people you swore to serve." A hush pressed down over the chamber. Even the chant outside seemed to falter for a moment, as if the crowd knew the strike was about to land. She stepped forward until the edge of the table was only inches from her hand, her shadow cutting across Abbott's notes. "You call it strategy, I call it sabotage of democracy," written in red ink and carried out in the dead of night. The line hit like a body blow, and somewhere in the gallery, reporter exhaled sharply. The sound caught on a hot mic can broadcast into living rooms across America. Jasmine let the silence sharpen, her eyes never leaving his. "So tell us, Governor," she said, each word slow, deliberate. "When the history books are written, do you want your name listed as a leader, or as the man who sold Texas to a war it never asked for?" The question didn't just challenge him. It left him no safe way out, and the entire room leaned forward as if waiting for him to take the fall. Jasmine didn't lower the memo in her hand. She let it dangle just enough to draw every gaze back to her, then shifted her tone from cold indictment to something far more dangerous: personal history. "Before you were governor, Greg Abbott, you were a lawyer. You stood in courtrooms, hand on the same law you're now shredding, swearing to uphold justice for the people of this state." Her voice had that knife's edge that made every word sound like it was carved in stone. She took one slow step toward the witness table. "You swore to protect the powerless. You swore to guard the rights of every Texan." A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed over Abbott's face, the kind of shadow that comes when old truths are dragged into the light. Jasmine leaned in just far enough for her voice to drop, but not enough for the microphones to miss a syllable. "So tell me, Governor, when did that oath expire?" The line sliced through the chamber like a sudden gust in still air. There was a low ripple of murmurs from the gallery, the kind of sound that carries both disbelief and satisfaction. Even some committee members shifted in their seats, as if the temperature in the room had just changed. Abbott gripped his pen again, harder this time, and the faint click of the plastic echoed in the hushed space. His gaze shifted to the floor, then back to Jasmine, then away again. The restless movements of a man trying to find an answer that wouldn't damn him. The cameras didn't miss a single twitch, cutting between his face and the frozen maps behind him, the red lines now silent accusation. Jasmine didn't let the pause cool. She placed the memo flat on the table in front of him, sliding it forward just enough that his fingertips brushed the paper. "I've read the cases you argued, Governor," she said, her voice tightening. "Cases where you defended the very protections you're dismantling today. So was that you telling the truth back then, or is this you telling the truth now?" The question wasn't just rhetorical. It was a vice, squeezing him between two versions of himself he couldn't reconcile. The gallery had gone so still that the faint whir of the live-stream cameras became audible. Aides exchanged glances, didn't move. Any motion now would look like panic, and panic was already bleeding into Abbott's body language. Jasmine stepped back just slightly, giving him the illusion of space, while every lens in the room moved closer. Her eyes never left his. "Is this the moment, Governor," she asked, each word sharp and deliberate, "that you lose Texas forever?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of 1,000 viewers leaning toward their screens, waiting to see if the man in the hot seat would even try to answer. The chamber doors opened again, but this time it wasn't staff or press. It was a slow, deliberate procession that made every conversation die mid-sentence. Survivors from the hill country flood stepped inside, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor like the approach of a verdict. In their hands were framed photographs, waterlogged and warped, the glass edges taped to keep from falling apart. At the front, a man in a faded work jacket held his picture high, a smiling young woman with dark hair pulled into a ponytail. His voice cracked as he shouted, "We buried my sister while you read your maps." The words detonated in the chamber, raw and unpolished, cutting through every layer of political theater. Two women followed close behind, one carrying a child's baseball glove, its leather stiff from drying in the sun after being dredged from the wreckage. The other holding a folded blanket still stained with mud. They didn't speak, but their faces told more than any speech could. Loss that wasn't just personal, but permanent. The gallery leaned forward, silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Jasmine stepped aside, giving the survivors the center of the frame. She didn't need to speak yet. The scene spoke for her. Abbott's gaze faltered. For the first time since the hearing began, his posture slumped just slightly, his hands tightening around the pen in front of him, until his knuckles went pale. Cameras caught the twitch of his mouth, the quick blink, the momentary drop of his eyes toward the table. In a hearing fueled by calculation and strategy, this was the first unguarded crack, the first sign of guilt breaking through the veneer. The man with the photograph took one step closer to the witness table, his voice rising. "While we were digging through mud for the people we loved, you were digging for ways to keep us from voting." "That's the truth, Governor," gasps rippled through the gallery, and outside the chant surged again, pounding against the chamber walls. Abbott's fingers drummed once against the desk, then stopped, a small tell that the cameras zoomed in on immediately. Jasmine stepped back into the spotlight, her eyes sweeping from the survivors to the governor. Her tone was measured but razor sharp. "They came here to be seen, not erased. So, Governor, look at them. Look at what you traded away." She held the silence just long enough for the audience to lean in, for the outside chance to slip under the door like a rising tide. Then she delivered the line that sliced through the room like a cold wind. "How many lives, Governor, would you give away before you redraw the one line that matters, the line between right and wrong?" The question landed like a verdict still waiting to be read, and the chamber braced for the weight of his answer. Jasmine let the raw anger in the room settle into a heavy, aching quiet. She placed her hands flat on the table, leaning forward just enough for her voice to drop, smoothing the sharp edges into something low and deliberate. "Governor," she said, and the word carried none of the venom from before. It came almost like an invitation. This is your chance to lead, not follow orders." Her tone was steady, but beneath it was a tremor of urgency, the kind that slips into a room when there's still one last door open before it locks forever. The survivors stood behind her in silence, their photographs and mementos catching the camera light, the faces of the dead looking out from bent frames. The gallery, so restless minutes ago, now felt like a church before a funeral prayer. Even the press had stopped scribbling, their pens hovering above notepads, waiting to see if this moment, this shift, might break the rhythm of combat that had defined the hearings so far. Jasmine held his gaze, not as an accuser now, but as someone offering him a thin lifeline. Abbott's eyes flickered up, then down, his lip trembled, almost imperceptibly, the muscles straining against a mask that had held for years. It wasn't defeat, not yet, but it was the closest thing to a human crack that anyone in that room had seen from him. Jasmine gave him space, stepping back a fraction, letting the air between them feel less like a battleground and more like a hallway he could choose to walk down. The pause stretched, the kind of pause that makes viewers lean closer to their screens, their hearts ticking in sync with the silence. Outside, the chant had softened into a single voice amplified through a bullhorn. "Do the right thing." It carried into the chamber like a reminder of the stakes, like the echo of a conscience. Abbott's hands twitched on the tabletop, his pen rolling once between his fingers. He looked as if he might speak, as if the weight of the photographs behind Jasmine had pressed some hidden truth to the surface. But then, nothing, no words, just a long, slow blink and a breath he didn't quite finish. Jasmine straightened, her expression sharpening again, the warmth slipping back into steel. The chance had been offered. It wasn't hers to keep open forever. She let the silence linger one heartbeat longer, then delivered her closing line with the precision of a final warning. "I'm asking you, Governor, for the people who trusted you, are you willing to stand up today? Or should Texas stop expecting you to stand up at all?" The question dropped into the chamber like a stone into deep water, and every ripple that followed felt like the beginning of the end. The softness in Jasmine's tone evaporated in an instant. She reached for a thick manila folder at her side, and with a sharp, echoing crack, slammed it down onto the table so hard that several people in the gallery flinched. Pages fanned out under the force, the top one stamped with an unmistakable seal. Federal Emergency Management Agency, Disaster Relief Allocation. Jasmine didn't sit, she stood over the folder like it was exhibit in a trial, her voice slicing through the stillness. "These are the federal disaster relief funds, hundreds of millions earmarked for Texas after the Hill Country flood. And here are the signatures of your allies, Governor, rejecting them." The word seemed to stun the room into a momentary paralysis. Then came the reaction, a wave of audible gasps breaking through the tension like glass shattering. In the second row, a Republican member stiffened, muttered something under his breath, and rose from his seat, pushing past colleagues with a sharp scrape of his chair legs. The heavy chamber doors thudded shut behind him, but not before the microphones picked up the tail end of his muttering, "This is political suicide." Jasmine opened the folder wide for the cameras, flipping through page after page, each stamped with dates, amounts, and rejection memos written in sanitized bureaucratic language. The people outside these walls lost their homes, their families, their sense of safety. And this, she slapped another page down, is what your administration told them. No, not because Texas couldn't use the money, but because you didn't like where it came from. Abbott's jaw was tight enough to crack. His aides shifted nervously, whispering without lifting their heads. The sound of the outside crowd swelled, chants rising into a furious rhythm, pounding against the doors like a storm trying to get in. Jasmine stepped closer to the witness table, the folder now in her hands like a weapon. You turned away help in the middle of a disaster. You let politics decide who got to rebuild and who was left with rubble. Her voice was steady, but there was heat in it now, heat the microphones caught and carried. She leaned forward, locking eyes with him, each word deliberate, spaced just enough to sting. When politics kills, Governor, who is to blame? The question didn't hang passively. It dropped into the chamber like a live grenade, and every face in the room betrayed the same thought. Sooner or later, someone was going to have to pick it up. Abbott finally straightened in his chair, gripping the microphone like a lifeline, his voice pitched to project authority even as the tension in the room threatened to crush it. What we have here, he began, letting his gaze sweep over the committee, is nothing more than a partisan spectacle. A stunt by a Democrat who would rather flee the state than do her job. She's here to score headlines, not to solve problems. His tone carried the cadence of a practiced defense, each syllable measured, as if reciting from a script. The words echoed for a moment, and then Jasmine leaned forward, the faintest smile tugging at her mouth. Not amusement, but the kind of grin that says you just walked into my trap. She didn't look at him, she looked down at the folder in front of her, flipping open to a stack of prepared statements. Governor, I'm glad you brought up problem solving, she said, her voice cool, almost conversational. Because I have here letters from people who actually live those problems, and they don't wear my party's badge. She lifted the first page, the letterhead stamped with the seal of a small Texas city. Mayor Robert Callahan, Republican, he writes, and I quote, "If standing up to the governor's political games makes me a partisan, then I'm proud to be one." A ripple went through the room. She turned to another, Mayor Linda Garza, Republican, Hill Country District. I stood in floodwater up to my knees. We needed help, not redistricting maps. Representative Crockett is doing more for my people than the governor. Each quote landed like a slap, the bipartisan names cutting through Abbott's narrative. The cameras panned between his face, tightening, narrowing, and Jasmine's steady delivery. Even members of the committee shifted in their seats, eyes flicking toward one another as if wondering how much of this was about to make it into tomorrow's headlines. Jasmine laid the stack down, her palm resting on top of it. So, Governor, if it's partisan to stand with the people of my state, people in both parties, against someone who turned away in their darkest hour, then maybe you should tell them to their faces what side you're really on. She let the challenge breathe, the silence afterward as deliberate as her words. Outside, the crowd had picked up a new chant, one the microphones caught faintly. We see you, we see you. Abbott's knuckles were white against the tabletop, the pen in his hand now motionless. Jasmine didn't soften, she tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without flinching. So tell us, Governor, is your loyalty to your party, or to the people who are still pulling mud from their living rooms? The line hung in the air like a verdict not yet spoken, and the cameras caught every second of his hesitation. By the time Jasmine lowered her hand from that last question, the internet had already ignited. Clips of her dismantling Abbott's partisan stunt accusation hit Twitter, now X, within minutes, captioned with side-by-side screenshots. Jasmine, eyes locked and unflinching. Abbott, mid-blink, jaw tight. On TikTok, the soundbite, maybe you should tell them to their faces, what side you're really on, was already looping under bold text overlays, the view counts ticking upward so fast they blurred. YouTube channels that normally covered sports or celebrity gossip were live streaming the hearing feed, their chats scrolling with hashtag stand with Jasmine, hashtag puppet governor, and the most cutting of all, hashtag maps over lives. Cable news caught up just as the hashtags cracked the top 5 nationwide. CNN split its screen in a perfect visual dagger, Jasmine on the left, speaking into her mic with the stillness of a surgeon. Abbott on the right, grimacing, his eyes darting away from the camera as if looking for an exit. Fox News ran the same split, but with a banner that read, Texas Showdown. Abbott confronted over flood relief, voting maps. MSNBC simply plastered 3 words across the bottom. Who does he serve? Back in the hearing, phones buzzed nonstop, not just in the gallery, but at the committee table itself. Staffers glanced down and quickly tucked devices back under folders, knowing every motion was being caught on camera. In the hallway outside, reporters spoke in rushed tones to producers, gesturing toward the door as if they could will the moment to last longer, to capture one more viral line before it ended. Jasmine, aware of the feeding frenzy beyond the chamber walls, didn't lean into it. She let the storm swirl on its own. That restraint made it worse for Abbott, whose discomfort was now on an endless loop, replayed in GIFs, memes, and slow-motion close-ups. Every hesitation, every tightening of his jaw became a metaphor in the public's mind, reinforced with captions like "caught in the act" and "this is what cornered looks like." The crowd outside had shifted chance again. Now it was answer her, answer her. And though the door stayed shut, the sound punched through in bursts, sensing with the thrum of notifications vibrating in the pockets of nearly everyone in the room. The line between the live hearing and the digital war beyond had dissolved. Every second here was already archived, dissected, and weaponized out there. Jasmine leaned back just slightly, her voice calm but pitched perfectly for the mix. It seems, Governor, the people aren't waiting for you to answer me. They're answering for themselves. She let her gaze sweep the room, then settle on him one last time. So if you won't speak to me, will you speak to them? The question, now amplified by millions of screens, didn't just hang in the air. It hunted him across every platform. Jasmine didn't shuffle papers or glance at notes. She simply leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, her eyes fixed on Abbott with an intensity that locked every camera in the room onto them both. Her voice was calm, almost measured, but it carried the weight of an executioner reading the final charge. Governor, she began, do you serve the people of Texas or the man in Mar-a-Lago? The question sliced through the humid air of the chamber, and for a moment, it seemed the room itself leaned in to hear his answer. Abbott's lips parted, then closed again. His eyes darted once toward the portrait of Trump behind him, a movement so quick the untrained eye might have missed it, but the cameras didn't. In the gallery, or reporters, Ben hovered mid-sentence. Outside, the crowd's chants stutter, waiting for the sound of his voice. But no words came. Jasmine didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it calcify into something heavier, more dangerous. The microphones picked up the faintest sounds, the click of a camera shutter, the rhythmic tap of someone's shoe under the committee table, the hum of the overhead lights. On the split screens broadcasting across the country, one half showed Jasmine, still, unwavering, gaze unbroken. The other showed Abbott, jaw set, fingers gripping the pen like it was the last thing tethering him to control. The pause began to metastasize. It wasn't just a lack of speech anymore. It was a refusal, a statement in itself. The public watching from their couches, their phones, their break rooms, knew instinctively that this wasn't a man searching for the right words. This was a man weighing the cost of telling the truth against the cost of telling a lie. Somewhere behind the dais, a chair creaked as a committee member shifted. Abbott's aides leaned forward, whispering rapid-fire advice he didn't seem to hear. The camera closest to him caught the twitch of his jaw muscle, the slow narrowing of his eyes, the way his shoulders sank just slightly. Still, nothing. Jasmine's voice returned, softer now, almost surgical in its precision. The people of Texas are watching, Governor. They've heard every excuse, they've seen every map, and now they're watching to see if you can even say their name before his. The crowd outside erupted again, their chant morphing into a single, pounding demand. Answer her. Answer her. She straightened, her hands folding neatly in front of her, giving the appearance of someone who had already won the exchange. The silence remained, thick and immovable. Jasmine let her gaze sweep the room one last time, then landed it back on him for the kill line. In politics, Governor, silence isn't neutral, it's a choice. And the only question now is, who did you just choose? The words fell like a gavel strike, and the chamber braced for the shockwave that would follow. The moment the gavel struck to adjourn, the walls of the chamber seemed to breathe out all at once. But outside, the air was anything but calm. The protest crowd had doubled in size since the morning, spilling across the Capitol steps and down the streets, their voices weaving together in a volatile mix of chants, music, and fiery speeches shouted through megaphones. Handmade signs bobbed above the sea of heads. Maps kill democracy. Texas is watching. Flood money first. The drumline that had been keeping a steady beat all day now pounded harder, each strike reverberating through the stone and glass of the building like a countdown to something bigger. Greg Abbott emerged through a side exit, flanked by a phalanx of security in dark suits, their earpieces glinting in the sun. The crowd spotted him instantly, a wave of sound rising like a physical force, a roar mixed with jeers, questions, and accusations hurled from every direction. Security tightened formation, ushering him toward a waiting black SUV. Cameras and smartphones swung toward him, shutters snapping in rapid fire as if trying to capture proof of retreat. Abbott kept his eyes forward, his pace steady, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the strain of walking through a wall of noise that felt inches from breaking. On the opposite side of the plaza, Jasmine Crockett stepped out into the light, and the reaction was immediate. The crowd's tone shifted, chants morphing into cheers and applause, a surge of bodies pressing forward to catch a glimpse. Reporters swarmed from every angle, microphones thrust toward her, the air alive with overlapping questions. What's your next move? Do you think he'll resign? Will you push for federal investigation? The crush of attention was so dense that even her aides had to push back against the encroaching circle of media. Jasmine raised a hand, not to silence them but to cut through the chaos. Her voice, still raw from hours in the chamber, carried over the din. Today wasn't about me and it wasn't about him. It was about the people of Texas, and the truth they deserve. The crowd erupted, but the reporters kept pressing, their cameras rolling, every lens trying to capture her next words. Behind her, the Capitol's facade gleamed in the afternoon sun, the sound of the protest now constant, living backdrop, a reminder that the fight had spilled far beyond the marble floors inside. Across the plaza, Abbott's SUV doors slammed shut, the engine roaring to life before it vanished into a convoy of tinted windows and flashing lights. Jasmine turned back toward the crowd, the nose swelling again, and the cameras leaned in as she delivered her last words before disappearing into the throng of supporters. If today proved anything, it's that silence can't protect the powerful forever. So the only question now is, how long before the next wall comes down? The words hung in the warm Texas air, and the people roared as if the collapse had already begun. The door to the backroom closed with a heavy click, sealing out the noise of the crowd still chanting outside. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and adrenaline. Around the lawn oak table sat Jasmine Crockett, State Representative Jean Wu, and a half-dozen civil rights leaders from across Texas, veterans of court battles, grassroots campaigns, and street protests. Some still had sweat on their brows from marching that afternoon, their shirts rumpled, voices hoarse. The tension was electric. No one was here to make small talk. Jean leaned forward first, tapping the table with the blunt end of his pen. "We've got him cornered in the court of public opinion," he said, "but the legal angle's clean. We can push the federal investigation now." Across from him, an older NAACP attorney shook her head sharply. "No. We've seen how slow the courts move. By the time there's a ruling, the maps will be drawn, the votes cast, and the damage done. We need to keep this in the headlines every day until he breaks." Jasmine sat back, listening, her fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm on the tabletop. She could feel the pull of both arguments, the methodical grind of legal recourse versus the raw, public fire that had fueled today's hearing. The room buzzed with layered voices, one strategist advocating for a multi-state coalition, another warning of voter fatigue if the spectacle dragged on too long. Tapers slid across the table, polling data showing Abbott's approval dropping, screenshots of trending hashtags, draft press releases already primed for the morning cycle. Finally, Jasmine straightened in her chair, her voice cutting through the crosstalk like a gavel. "The legal fight will come, but right now, people are listening. They're angry, they're ready, and they need to see us fight in broad daylight. Not in closed courtrooms, not in filings that get buried on page 7. We go louder, we go bigger, we take this to every district, every county, every camera that will have us." The room went still, the decision crystallizing in that instant. Jean leaned back, nodding, a slow grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. One of the younger activists pulled out her phone and began drafting a statewide rally schedule on the spot. The NAACP attorney closed her folder without another word, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement that the choice had been made. Jasmine reached for the map on the wall, the same one she had used to eviscerate Abbott in the hearing, and tapped 3 red districts. "We start here," she said, her tone hard with intent. "And we don't stop until they either fix the lines or the people erases." The words landed with the weight of a battle cry, and for a brief moment, the quiet room felt louder than the streets outside. The email dump hit like a thunderclap. It was just past 7 a.m. when inboxes across the Texas press corps lit up with a zip file labeled "Only Proof." By 7:15, it was everywhere. Political blogs, local news sites, cable producers' Slack channels. This second leak was worse than anyone had imagined. Not just policy memos or redistricting drafts. These were direct communications between Abbott's office and a network of national GOP megadonors, spelling out a plan to block federal disaster aid unless political conditions were met. The language was blunt, transactional, dripping with the kind of cynicism that doesn't care if it's ever caught. One thread in particular exploded across social media, a donor suggesting that withholding funds from the Hill Country would apply pressure on local officials to support the redistricting push. The reply from Abbott's senior advisor was a single line: "Governor agrees, proceed." By the time cable morning shows picked it up, the chyron was already blazing in all caps: "Governor Abbott tied to disaster fund scandal." CNN split the screen. On one side, the leaked email with that incriminating sentence circled in red. On the other, footage from the Capitol steps where flood survivors held their ruined possessions in trembling hands. MSNBC pulled up archival footage of Abbott promising full support to disaster victims, juxtaposed with the timeline of aid denial. Even Fox News, careful with its wording, ran a story under the headline, "Questions Mao over disaster relief decisions." Over disaster relief decisions. By mid-morning, reporters were camped outside the governor's mansion, their breath puffing in the cool air, cameras rolling for any sign of movement. Abbott's spokespeople issued a terse statement calling the leak selectively edited political attacks, but it did little to slow the avalanche. Every hour brought a new angle. Legal analysts weighing in on abuse of power statutes, former staffers hinting that more emails might surface, grassroots organizers announcing emergency rallies in every major Texas city. In the war room Jasmine had set up the night before, her team watched the coverage in real time. Jean Mu stood near the TV, arms crossed, as a local anchor recapped the most damning points. "We don't even have to push this," one strategist said quietly. "It's moving under its own weight now." Jasmine, however, didn't look triumphant. She looked focused. "Weight is good," she replied, eyes still on the screen. "But we need direction. Chaos without aim is just noise. We turn this into a demand." Outside, protesters had already begun gathering again, the chants mixing with the sound of live news hits being filmed from the curb. The Capitol was becoming less a government building and more a stage. Every step, every silence, every camera angle feeding the narrative, and hanging over all of it was the question being asked on every broadcast, every podcast, every diner-counter conversation in Texas: will this force Abbott to resign? No one had the answer yet, but the way the air felt, heavy, electric, dangerous, suggested the story was far from finished. The chamber was packed to the edges for closing statements, the air heavy with the residue of days of scandal and confrontation. The red-on-air light glared overhead once more, and every camera swung toward the center dais where Jasmine Crockett stood, hands braced on the wood as if anchoring herself before delivering the final blow. Her eyes swept the room, not searching for approval, but locking in on the weight of what was about to be said. "This hearing was about maps," she began, her voice slow, deliberate, but it was always about something bigger. "The lives these lines destroy." She turned toward the gallery, where survivors of the Hill Country flood sat shoulder to shoulder, photographs of loved ones clutched in their hands. While water swallowed their homes, while families buried their dead, the governor's office was redrawing districts to make sure their voices would never matter again. The words rolled out with a quiet fury, each syllable sharp enough to cut. She pivoted back to the committee, her gaze grazing Abbott without lingering. Voter suppression isn't just about elections, it's about the chain reaction of powerlessness. When you erase communities from the map, you erase their leverage to demand flood barriers, safe roads, disaster relief. You condemn them to suffer twice, once from the disaster itself, and again from the government that refuses to hear them. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of the lights overhead, the weight of her words settling on every shoulder. Abbott sat at the witness table, stone-faced, his eyes fixed somewhere on the far wall. He didn't flinch, didn't nod, didn't even blink more than necessary, but his hand, resting on the tabletop, betrayed the smallest tremor. Jasmine stepped closer, her voice tightening. When a state chooses maps over lives, when political control matters more than human survival, that is not leadership, that is abandonment. The press gallery leaned forward as she planted her final line. Governor Abbott, you can avoid my eyes all you want, but the people of Texas are looking right at you, and they will remember exactly what you did when their voices and their lives were on the line. She let the silence that followed coil around the room, a tension that made the cameras draw tighter on both their faces. Then, just before she stepped back, she delivered the hope that would echo beyond the chamber. And when the people finally speak, will you have the courage to look at them then? The question hung in the air like the last crack before the break, and every lens in the room waited for him to move. For a moment after Jasmine's final words, the chamber was frozen. No shuffle of papers, no cough, no clink of glass. It was as if the air itself had been struck still. Then, almost as one, half the chamber rose to their feet. The sharp crack of palms meeting filled the room, echoing off the high ceiling, rolling over the mahogany desks in waves. Some clapped slowly at first, the weight of the moment still sinking in, while others applauded with the kind of conviction that was less about politics and more about survival. In the gallery, the survivors and activists, who had sat through every minute of the hearing, surged to their feet, cheers breaking out like a sudden storm. Photographs of lost loved ones were raised high, not as memorials now, but as proof that their voices had been carried into the record and could not be erased. A woman in the front row, still in a windbreaker stain from clean-up work, cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "We're with you, Jasmine." The cry rippled outward, swallowed by applause. Jasmine didn't bow or gesture for quiet. She stood rooted where she was, eyes scanning the crowd, her expression neither triumphant nor softened. This wasn't a victory lap, it was a vow. She glanced once toward Abbott's table, empty now except for the untouched glass of water, condensation pooling into a ring. At some point in the ovation, he had gathered his notes in a tight stack, slid them into his briefcase, and, flanked by security, slipped through the side exit without so much as a glance toward the cameras or the press pack waiting outside. But the press followed. Reporters and photographers broke from the gallery like a pack unleashed, racing down the hall to catch him before the elevator doors could close. Questions were shouted. "Governor, will you resign? Do you deny the leak? Will you face the protesters?" None were answered. The only sound from his entourage was the brisk pace of polished shoes against marble and the click of the elevator gate. Back in the chamber, the applause began to ebb, replaced by the low murmur of conversation, the snapping of camera shutters, the quiet exchange of looks that said everyone present understood they had witnessed a pivot point. Jasmine stepped down from the dais, the crowd in the gallery leaning over the rail to shake her hand, pass her letters, whisper words of thanks. She paused at the threshold before leaving, glancing toward the vacant witness chair one last time. The cameras caught it, that brief, still moment that read like a statement without a single word spoken. "He can leave the room," she said finally, voice low but carrying, "but he can't walk away from this." And with that, she turned into the flash of the hallway lights, where the next battle was already waiting. The camera found her just beyond the chamber doors, framed by the fading amber light spilling in from the west windows. Her hair was slightly disheveled from the crush of people, her suit jacket still creased where she'd leaned hard into the witness table, but her gaze was steady, the kind of steady that tells you she hasn't exhaled yet. She didn't look at the reporters, the staffers, or even the supporters still trailing behind her. She looked straight into the lens, as if she were staring directly into the living rooms, break rooms, and kitchen tables of the people watching. "Justice isn't given," she said, her voice lower now, but carrying with the same precision she'd used in the chamber. "It's fought for, and today was just the beginning." She didn't blink, didn't soften the line with a smile. The weight of the day hung in the pause that followed, the testimony, the leaks, the silence that had said more than words ever could. Behind her, the crowd outside was still going, The chants folding into speeches, to speeches into music. The Texas sky was awash in deep orange and violet, the setting sun casting the protesters' silhouettes in sharp relief. Signs waved like banners in an old war painting, maps over lights. Never, we see you, aid for Texas now. The sound was chaotic, but it had rhythm, a heartbeat you could feel through the floor. On screen, white text began to fade in over the image of Jasmine standing there, shoulders squared, backlit by the fire of the horizon. If you were in that chamber, would you have stood with her? The question lingered, unhurried, letting the viewer sit with the discomfort of an answer that might be harder than it seems. The frame didn't cut away immediately. It stayed on her for several seconds, the light behind her dimming as the chants grew louder, as if the sun itself refused to set before the day's work was truly over. Then the image widened, pulling the viewer into the full scope of the scene. The plaza packed shoulder to shoulder, the makeshift stage where speakers rallied the crowd, the flags and signs bobbing in unison against the vast Texas sky. The chant rose to a unified roar, the kind that drowns out doubt and turns strangers into allies. Jasmine didn't move, didn't turn from the lens. And just before the screen began to fade to black, her voice came once more, not a shout but a promise, threaded with steel. Next time, we fight harder. The frame went dark, leaving only the sound of the crowd echoing under the Texas sunset, a reminder that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. True change doesn't happen in moments of comfort. It's forged in the heat of confrontation, when speaking the truth risks everything but staying silent costs even more. Jasmine's fight is a reminder that integrity is measured not by the titles we hold, but by the people we choose to stand with when it matters most. In life, we will all face moments where the easy road demands our silence. The question is, will we take it or will we stand firm? If you were in that chamber today, whose side would you truly be on? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.